Blood Oath When the Sword Rises was a 32 versus 32 medieval battle simulator. Think of a Mount and Blade, but with, well, a little bit more flair. Sieges, battles, and pitched fights, it was all there. Teams and clans building together for a new kind of medieval arcade experience. But it wasn't just that. It was so much more than just a 64-player hack 'em up. Let me introduce to you the free mode. The idea would be for peasants to gather resources, craftsmen make them into weaponry, and soldiers go off and fight. All real players creating this living and breathing world. There was a whole system, everything from serfs to kings and lords, provinces with kingdoms and special resources in certain areas that would be controlled by different players and clans. There was also a full air system and completely customized servers so that anybody could host and make their own. This was the open world MMO style medieval game that many had been waiting for. It all seemed so good. Maybe just too good to be true though, but it doesn't end there. There was even a demo you could play and I actually got my hands on it, although back in the day it was very basic and this was the time where players had already started to drop off, so the signs were starting to show and the cracks were coming through. There were also private events hosted by the developers set up with real players. So it seemed like all was going to go ahead with Blood Oath. But what happened? You see, this video isn't just about Blood Oath. This is about 5 medieval games that had so much potential but ended up dying a sad death. Maybe they didn't have the budget. Maybe players just got bored or the developers didn't know what they were doing. Either way, get your Kleenex out, but not for that. In April of 2021, Blood Oath When the Sword Rises released a statement on their Discord, saying, "Over the last year, we've been discussing all the events that impacted the development of Blood Oath both directly and indirectly, and unfortunately one of our core members had to go." They then went on to state how Blood Oath When the Sword Rises had been in development for almost 5 years. Their plan was to release that 32 versus 32 arcade mode as a standalone and use that funding to develop the free mode. However, the first Kickstarter didn't raise enough money, meaning that they decided to just go ahead and try and develop the free mode version anyway. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. They didn't generate enough revenue to support this free mode development and they were forced to shut down. Now, the Discord for Distortion Games, who are the developer, are still up and there are actually a few servers still on there that the demo can be played on. However, it's pretty much completely dead at this point. So what happened? Well, it's clear that funding was the main issue. You could state it was development team, but that all really comes down and resolves in the end of having enough money to pay the correct developers. Of course, being a multiplayer only title, it would thrive off its player base. If they didn't gain enough traction from the Kickstarter, it was clear that there wasn't the player base in order to keep a massive open world medieval game going like they expected. Unfortunately though, this isn't a one-off occurrence. What happened with Blood Oath When the Sword Rises had actually happened a few years earlier, and you can't mention medieval games that failed without talking about Of Kings and Men. Oh my, what a missed opportunity this was. In 2015, it was the peak of Mount and Blade, and especially its multiplayer. The Persistent World mod was an open world modification for Warband that gave players the opportunity to roleplay as serfs, blacksmiths, knights, and lords. Sounds a little bit like Blood Oath. Well, this was where it all started. Forming clans, owning castles, and creating events and sieges across the big Mount and Blade open world. Of course, it was only a matter of time before a standalone version of this Persistent World mod came out, and whilst Blood Oath When the Sword Rises was a version of it, Of Kings and Men was the first to try and recreate it. Of Kings and Men was developed by the Donkey Crew, a full-scale medieval open world, a map spanning across countries with territory, lands, and kingdoms. Players would create clans that would own these regions and form alliances or make enemies across the map. This open world promised NPCs that would help collect wood, mine, and resources to build your cities, giving players that free time and opportunity to train themselves as soldiers, gear up, and make a stir on the battlefield. Clans started to form, and even an early access version of the game was announced in order to help fund the Epic. Oh yeah, the Epic was the Of Kings and Men version of the free mode. It was that open world portion of the game. Before, it was just an arcadey style of battle. Where have we heard this before? When Of Kings and Men did actually come out, it was a basic tech demo with Mount and Blade style multiplayer battles, capturing points, or team deathmatch game modes. And the game actually looked great for a small indie team. The combat was kinda decent, and whilst it's pretty much unheard of any game's combat system to reach the height of what Mount and Blade achieved, Of Kings and Men did a pretty good job of trying to do something different but keeping that same kind of feel. And people were pretty happy on the initial early access launch. The game was coming along well and they had some actual bits and pieces to play whilst players waited for the real core of the game, this open world. And then months passed by. The Epic was supposedly in development, but not much all came out about it. Months turned into years and still nothing. Then, all of a sudden, an update came out called the Epic. This was it. This was the massive open world that everyone had been waiting for. Everybody jumped into the game and, oh, it's just a map. A map with little pieces that move around. Where was this open world? with battles, NPCs, city building, players joining clans. Where was it all? Many more months passed and nothing really came out about it. Players started to give up and the game started to die. The developers then soon announced its cancellation, and a year or so later, it was removed from Steam completely. It was a tale of a small development team that had a vision and connected with so many, but they didn't have the resources in order to complete such a big undertaking. Let's have a small moment for Kings and Men. Hey, at least the Donkey Crew, the developers, are now moving on to something else. By the way, they're making The Last Oasis. But I've heard people like that one. 2012 was a massive renaissance for many games, perhaps one of the best years in gaming, full stop. After the massive success of Mount & Blade, many devs wanted to follow up and do something new. Chivalry Medieval Warfare released and was incredibly successful, perhaps more so than Mount & Blade even before it, coming from a Half-Life mod and fledging into a fully formed medieval slash-em-up. But there was another. It released within a few months of Chivalry Medieval Warfare, and it had a similar amount of hype and potential, yet it didn't quite keep its head above the water. This game was War of the Roses. War of the Roses was a game set, War of the Roses. It was actually developed by Fat Shark, you know, the guys that made Warhammer Vermintide. I'm glad they've gone on to do better things since then. Set during the 15th century England, the title itself actually had some really great things, like character customization, a unique, effective, and pretty decent combat system, and a pretty good looking game at that. I remember the first time seeing this thing was during its initial release stage with the Yogscast showcasing it along with Chivalry on their channel. It looked so much fun and I really couldn't wait to get into it. Unfortunately, by the time that I was actually old enough to get my hands on the game for myself, it had all but died. In fact, it even had released into a free-to-play version, yet that wasn't enough to keep it going. So what went wrong with War of the Roses? Well, it was a multiplayer-only title that had competed with the likes of Chivalry Medieval Warfare, a game that was so refined and so popular at the time that there wasn't all that much competition. The combat itself was very similar to Mount & Blades, but still felt a little clunky alongside it. And whilst if it was a game completely separate to anything else, it would have been good combat, but the similarities to Mount & Blade meant it was constantly compared, which didn't give it a good look. Then there was the lack of content, multiplayer battles, and well, that's about it. That's all it really had, and that seemed to be the death for War of the Roses. They actually brought out another game a few years later called War of the Vikings. It was a similar based thing, you know, multiplayer pitched battles, but using Vikings as the name would suggest. That died even quicker than War of the Roses. Fat Shark have gone on to do some amazing things with Warhammer and Vermintide later on down the line, but boy was it a tricky time for them back in the day. There was a lot of potential here, and I really wish that the community had been there to make War of the Roses as big as its counterpart, yet it was never meant to be. Medieval Engineers had so much potential, and when I say so much potential, it came off the back of Space Engineers, a behemoth of a game in 2013. It had so much success that Keen Software wanted to go on and make a more primitive title based on that Space Engineers platform, an open medieval world, building castles, fully destructible terrain and buildings. There's still nothing really quite like it, yet development just didn't really go down the way everyone expected. They brought out a good amount of stuff, the combat was alright, there was NPCs, there was bandits. You could do some basic building, but it kind of stopped there. You see, the limitations went about as far as what the developers wanted to put in the game. There was no modding support, there was no community assets to it or anything like that. So when they decided that they'd focus on their more successful child, Space Engineers, Medieval Engineers was kept to the wayside. And months going by of no new updates, no new content, people were kind of bored of it. And that's where the game was left. So what could be one of the biggest medieval failures of all time? Well, this one's actually rather debatable, but this is still perhaps the biggest game on the list. This is Reign of Kings. Reign of Kings released in December of 2015. A new open world medieval game based off the likes of Rust and survival crafters like that. Destructible castles, medieval battles, clanning up, trebuchets, ballistas, swords, shields, spears. Players would struggle to survive in a harsh medieval world, hunting wildlife, mining resources, building structures, crafting weapons and armor in order to protect yourself. You were able to form guilds with other players and of course seize the throne and become the king. Players had the ability to hold, capture other players during battle, ransom them off later. It was a full, living, breathing community and a world that was really created by its players in a great way. They even had some cool, unique things like punishment and death. You could lock people in cages and dungeons, and this built and bred a completely new roleplay experience within this medieval survival. This was during 2015, with the boom of Rust coming up during that time. And whilst Rust managed to stand the test of time, Reign of Kings just didn't seem to do that. Maybe that was down to the big promotion at the start, with YouTubers like Frank Cranky on PC and Soviet Womble, Syndicate even getting their hands on the game, showing it off to their fans. This meant there was a massive influx at the start, but when these guys stopped playing the game, so did all their fans, meaning that the quick decline of players will probably have a negative effect on the look of the game. The combat was pretty good. It was kind of successful, but ranged combat was, well, it left something to be desired. But judging by the community, people adored this game. It had the potential to be something massive, but it just wasn't meant to be. Most people blame the developers themselves. Code Hatch have an interesting dark past, publishing games like Heat and Starforge, two other games that infamously died in a pretty similar way, especially Starforge. That was a big one. Most people blame it down to the scummy developers, saying that they just took the money and ran, but there was genuinely a decent game here. It managed to get people in because there was a lot of content and there was a lot of things to do. So would that really be what happened to a developer? Well, if it was just Reign of Kings, I'd probably just say it was disorganization, a lack of resources, or development time. But Code Hatch seemed to have a long-lasting reputation for building these games that get really popular, then leaving them and taking the money. So I don't really know what to think. As part of this historical gaming community, there have been a number of titles that have gone down this way, whose sights were set on something too big for them to accomplish. Fortunately though, there have been many more that have done really well out of it, and there have been some incredibly positive and successful stories that have come of it. But I guess that is for another video.